light today. Some of your cohort partners couldn't make it, but we're going to record it, send it to anyone that wasn't able to make it. So we'll be going over really some data integration work that's been happening. Some of it's been from NCTC, so we're glad you're all here. So that's what we'll do kind of initially, and then I think Annabelle has, if you want to give a preview of what we have after that.
Yeah, so, typically after lunch and we'll meet, now that we have two cohorts, we met with cohort 2 in the morning, we have the lunch hour and then the cohort 1 session. And so the first hour is what Delaney and Robert are going to be sharing with you as it relates to EMS tech solution. The second hour will be talking a little bit about workforce alignment. That is one of the year 2 priorities. And so we've got some recent labor market intelligence for your region. And it's really just gonna be roundtable dialogues. It's just, a small group. We have some labor market intelligence for Grayson and for NCTC. And, again, it's the big elephant in the room and we don't have all the answers, so we'll get to have a conversation about it. And that's it. Thanks, Robert.
Great. So what I like to think of when we kind of as EMS, when we bring in any new technology, whether it's data integration, and you may have the same, is like crawl, walk, and run, right? And most of the time, whenever you get a new tool, you want to go right to running, right? Let's just get the software up and going, or whatever program you have, you want to go right to running, which sometimes slows you down. And so that's what we'll be talking about, how we really get started with just walking, even if it's, crawling. It may not be pretty, but just to get the ball rolling on whatever we're working on, and then eventually walk and eventually run. So Delaney from T3, she'll be sharing how they're loading their ISD rosters. Barbara, you'll be interested in this and how they're able to do so at scale, because a lot of automation is doing something at scale. Kind of heard, I think, with the pathway manager, where she said she just had 8 schools at first and it was kind of manageable, but then as you start to scale, it's like, well, I can't keep doing Excel, when she went to 18 schools. And so I'll be talking about some of the matching that NCTC has been able to do. Tom's been able to build between 2 Salesforce systems. And then Mark will be showing some work we've done with the Texas College Bridge in order to automate some of their data. So we're not going to get too technical down into the weeds of it, but more of use cases for it and the benefits of going from manual processing to automation. So I'll start your presentation, Delaney. Did you just email me a new one?
Yes.
Okay, let me download it real quick.
Yeah, great.
Got it.
Change slides.
It doesn't work.
Oh,
So
it doesn't.
I can do it for you, or just use that.
That's okay. I can just see. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Delaney Clark. I am the Senior Systems Analyst with T3 or Tarrant 2 and 3 partnership. So as Robert mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the work that we've done to automate some of our ISD rosters. I'm going to provide just a little bit of brief background information about T3 in case anyone's not familiar. Apologies if this is redundant information though. So T3 is a nonprofit in Tarrant County that aims to ensure that more Tarrant County students have the training and skills that they need to thrive in today's workforce. This will be a little refresher of a statistic that we saw earlier this afternoon, but currently about 65% of jobs are requiring a post-secondary credential. And in Tarrant County specifically, right now, about 39% possess a post-secondary credential. So at Tarrant 2 and 3, we are trying to do the work to bridge the gap. And one other thing to mention is that this 65% statistic is actually from 2019, 2020, which was when T3 was founded, but that number is looking closer to 70% now. So that is just going to probably continue to increase. And then so on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit just high level about the work that T3 is doing to bridge the gap. We have several programmatic efforts. So we have scholarship opportunities, different mentorship opportunities. One of the biggest things really is closing the information gap that families have as well. And so whenever we think about all of these programmatic aspects, as most of us in the room probably know, to do them at scale, it really requires some sound technical infrastructure so that one person is not having to do 20 Excel spreadsheets all the time, hopefully. And And so to give you a little bit of an idea of what our program currently looks like is we do have two current ISD partners that are our pledge partners. So that means that we're currently working with two ISDs in Tarrant County for their students to actually be able to complete the pledge and enroll in into the T3 program. And so our current partners are Fort Worth ISD and Crowley ISD, which we just welcomed this year. And the roster file that we have automated is the Fort Worth ISD roster. So what that means with those two ISDs, we have about a little less than 12,000 students who are pledge eligible, which means that they're juniors and seniors. And so we currently serve 25 high schools, 23 of which are in Fort Worth ISD. That is our much larger ISD currently, and we have plans to launch to the rest of Tarrant County in the coming years. And so now to talk a little bit about what our roster process looked like for Fort Worth ISD prior to automation is that we were manually extracting this roster from S3. We're just using AWS S3 to transmit that file every day. We receive from Fort Worth ISD a one roster file, which is a standard specification for securely sharing class files between student information systems and other information systems. This is commonly used in a lot of different school districts, which I'll show you a little bit what that looks like on the next slide. And so once we receive that one roster file, which contains several different Excel spreadsheets in it, we would transform that data in an Excel document, which has several tabs with several complex formulas each time that we needed to use it, which was 2 to 3 times a week that we're loading this data to try to have the most accurate roster information corresponding to what is actually in Fort Worth ISDs at that time. So this is a little bit what the one roster file looks like. As you can see, pretty much every category of information is broken into a separate CSV file. We would use 3 of these and then plug manually into a master file that we had created. And so as you can see at the bottom, there are several tabs in this. These tabs contain different references, different formulas to look up and see the information that you have displayed here. Of course, this is mock information, but you can see some of our high school names brought over. And like I said, we were doing this 2 to 3 times a week and then loading it. So as you expand to different districts or as you have different files that you're loading, those 2 to 3 times a week activities that are taking 15 minutes really start to add up. And so as we know, we have plans to expand to further districts in the future. That's why we wanted to start automating our files now so that we have more capacity to work on the things that we want to work on rather than the same repetitive tasks 2 to 3 times a week. And so we used a product called Jitterbit to automate our roster. So Jitterbit is a pretty advanced ETL tool, and we have programmed it to automatically pick up the most recent Fort Worth ISD file from S3. And now it does all the transformation for us and loads into our Salesforce instance every weekday. So we currently have it set to perform this every weekday at 7 a.m. And but that's completely flexible depending on what your needs would be for the file that you're receiving. And so this is what our current map for the Fort Worth ISD or the schedule process looks like. Whenever we load it, we also receive a log of the students that were successful and the students that were not successful, which is another thing that I'd like to touch on, because there might be times where you're receiving data files that contain more data than you actually need for whatever reason. They might be schools that are not part of your process or students who are not the grade level that are yet needed to be enrolled in your process. And so you can actually set it to where this process actually filters through that data for you and make sure that it's only loading the data that you need in the standardized format that you need at that time. And so some of the results of this process is that we're able to identify actively enrolled Fort Worth IC students in real time. So at any moment, we're able to go to that student's contact record or their promise roster and see when that last roster was from. So we can know if they have moved schools, or if their date is a long time ago, that they are probably not actively enrolled in that district anymore. And another tool that we use on our reports and dashboard is we have a filter that limits the records displayed to only students that have been updated in the last 5 days. And the purpose for that, again, is just to make sure that we are focusing on those students that are actively enrolled in the program at that time. And so another huge benefit of this is, as I mentioned, several districts do use one roster. So we now, having this built out, if we are to create a partnership with another district that also utilizes one roster, then we already have the framework in place to automate that roster as well. And one of the most important things, that's all the slides that I have, but one of the most important things for any automation of any data processing is just really making sure that you're receiving it on a consistent basis and that the file is formatted consistently. I know for our automation, it looks at what the file names are and the title names are before it does any of that transformation. So that's really one of the most crucial parts of this. And that's a little bit about the work that we've done with Jitterbit at T3.
Thank you. I mean, Barbara may have questions.
Yes.
Or anyone has questions. Look like Barbara.
So if someone's been removed from the list, is it pulled them out of their roster as well, like on your scores?
If it's
At this point for me, I've already uploaded, so I'm not adding any, but like I'll get students, like they're telling me like they unenrolled. So does this like update that as well and pull them off of your roster?
So just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, it's a student who is no longer enrolled in that district, right? So whenever the way that we receive the file is whenever we only receive students that are enrolled. And so we include on that information the date that roster is brought into Salesforce. And so we have basically utilized filters because it doesn't remove the students from our system that were previously enrolled. So, but we're able to, because we have that date, that ETL date on their contact record, we can see the student disenrolled 2 months ago, because that was the last time that we received their roster. And then we also, again, on our reports and dashboards, we use like the filter based off of that date value of the last 5 days to make sure that that we're only communicating to students who are actively enrolled.
I think one thing that's interesting is when you watch these rosters, and you're probably seeing the same thing, is that especially when you're working with multiple districts, these students are moving in and out quite a bit. They're going from school to school, and they're going, so they'll come off the roster and they'll come right back on. Sometimes it's a mistake with the district making changes to the student information system.
Right.
So I think that strategy of keeping them there but marking them as not on roster and inactive is really helpful, because like Delaney's doing, then you know who that current one is, but then you don't lose all that data work you've done.
Right.
You've matched them, you've done all this historical tracking, that data coming in, texting, all that. It still keeps the record sound, but then you know the current status. I think that's been our strategy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely would recommend, as Mark mentioned, just keeping a record of that, so that then you can say, I have you in our system, but it shows that you disenrolled 2-3 months ago. You know, for that reason, depending on your program requirements, might not be eligible. Any other questions?
How long to buy to get?
So it's been a work in progress. From the time that we actually started building the automation until the time that we have been able to use it in production, I would say that was about 3.5 months. So, but prior to that, we were doing that manual work. And so whenever we were building this out, a lot of those same formulas or transformation cleaning of the data was the same. But we were just needing to automate it in Jitterbit. But the entire automation project specifically about 3.5 months.
We have some new promises with us that are in junior high. So just wanted to provide.
Yeah.
context that It doesn't just happen over.
No.
That's totally, this is great, we think this is a best practice in the end goal.
Certainly.
But it takes a lot of time.
Yeah, certainly. And something I'd like to add going off that, as I mentioned, T3 was started in 2020. So we were functioning for a few years before we did move forward with automating that. And that amount of time could vary based off of program. But one of the most important things is that we wanted to make sure that, okay, we're receiving the data the way that we want to. It's consistent, and we don't have plans to change that, because if you're still in the process of trying to decide if you want to add different fields or make different requests, that might be time to stop and consider, like, are we at where we need to be to complete this automation? Just something to consider before you maybe make investments in something that's gonna change quite easily at a later time. But yes, it does not happen overnight. It was very much a long time coming thing and a labor of love. A lot of work went into it. So if you're not here yet, that's totally okay. Something down the road to consider. Yeah.
I think your last point there kind of leads into my part with NCTC. So feel free to chime. Tom is the mastermind behind this. I'm just his mouthpiece for today. But it's very interesting. Sometimes, you go right to the walk and run stage only to like fall down, right? Especially if you had a kid that was an early walker, like when you start walking, the risk of falling increases versus when you're crawling, right? Like low risk, like low reward, but like low risk. And so when we started with NCTC, we found out they had some tools that some rural colleges like would love to have, like they have Informatica, which is an ETL tool. And so we had a discussion, like, should we go ahead and start to automate it, integrate the data like from day one? And that's a discussion we had. But kind of to Delaney's point, like if we would have went that route, like we would have been reworking that like the whole time, because we didn't necessarily know what we needed at that point, and understand, like, do we have enough data? How are we going to what are we for cohort number 2? And so when we had that break between cohort 1 and cohort 2, their student cohort starting, was like, okay, now's the time. We can take what we've learned from doing a lot of this manual work, and now we know what we want to express to Tom, and so him to kind of replicate and duplicate what we were doing manually. And so matching the promise applications. And so when a student pledges, we want to match them to the college, whatever college that may be. In this case, NCTC, we're kind of working with them. They're leading the program, but they also get a lot of those students. And so how do we match them up to the admissions application and all the other data that the college has? And so what we would do, we had a process that was very manual. A unique case, NCTC does have their own Salesforce. We're at BV with this just one sheet, and I think we have 10 sheets underneath here to do matching. And
It took me 2 years to build.
yeah, exactly. Yes. And we would use phrases like, all you have to do, like, when you tell someone like, all you have to do, is like, it's implying it's so simple and understand, like, all you have to do is this, and they're like, okay, so, for the first year, guess who did the data matching? I did the data matching, right? So it was just a lot faster. So, which I didn't mind, but I only was able to do it about once a week, right? When you're doing something manual, it's even though it's not complex, it's tedious, right? And when you're doing something manual, you got room for error. So even though you can go fast, you probably should go slower. So I would have to go slow. Then I had things here that's not on this tab to like double check what I'm doing to make sure there wasn't any user error. And so that's what we did for the first year. And so, but what issues did that cause? So a student, let's say they pledged today, let's say they did their NCTC admissions application. It might be 1 or 2 weeks before the counselor or the student would know, oh, I did the first 2 steps. I pledged and I did the application. It wouldn't show up in Salesforce. We would just see their pledge. So there would be a delay in time. And so what we have in Salesforce, we feed out to the counselors. So the counselors would look and say, well, did you do this? The student may say yes, but the counselor's looking at data that's a week old, maybe 2 weeks old, depending on how the matching time went. And so while it just seems like it's something simple, it actually affects the student experience when we don't have that live data or close to as real time as possible. So this is what, wrong way, oh, right way, let's see. Yeah, so that was once a week. So this is what we moved towards with Tom, with what he was able to build, which is instead of Excel, I think in one of my early conversations with Barbara, I says, when you think Excel, think Salesforce, like, or think automation, like Excel is, you know, we use it. That was in the crawl stage, right? Like you do what you have to do to get your work done. But now we were ready to move to that walk and run stage. And so with Informatica, Tom's able to connect to both Salesforce instances and pretty much do the matching, similar to what Jitterbit does, what Delaney explained, match the data. And it's not just one way, it's both ways. So the data that's in the Promise Salesforce can now be brought over easily and flag the students in their JRM system. And anything that's in JRM that the Promise team wants to see from their JRM Salesforce, it could be brought over once we have the student tagged in both systems. So we're right now in a Salesforce sandbox with this. We still got some more testing to do. So we hope by this week or next week, we'll be turning this on. And one of the benefits is going to be for possible matches. You know, matching, you try to get it 100%, but there's going to be exceptions, right? Even if you're at 95 to 99%, that's great. Something that Tom built in is he's putting the possible matches within Salesforce. So what would happen before was in my Excel sheet, I had a tab that said possible matches. That was one of my tags. I would split out the students that I really can't tell if it's really 100% match. I would have to then send that list to Barbara. Barbara would then look in their system and manually look at both records. Then she would let me know, yes, this student is a match. I would have to come back to my Excel sheet, kind of override the matching and says, this is a manual match. So every time that student would come through, now they're matched. And so it was a big process. Now all we have to do is Barbara just has to click a box that says match, like confirmed, and it automatically will match that student. So there's no back and forth. It's all going to happen here. So what we're looking at here is just a report of possible matches. We don't see it here, but there's just a box you'll be able to check, Barbara, that's going to make it simple. And no more emailing spreadsheets back and forth, or we would put it in the Salesforce notes. It'll just make it easy. Of course, now that it's in Salesforce, she could necessarily doesn't even have to look at this report. She could have this report emailed to her. And if there's no students in there, matter of fact, the report may not even go out if it's empty. If she gets the report, now she knows, oh, I have some possible matches from yesterday. And so as fast as NCTC is now loading their applications, it's going to be a one-day lag to the counselors. When they log in the morning, they see all the students NCTC got from the day before. So that's just one of the benefits, but the benefits extend beyond like those administering the Promise program. It goes to even the students. So if you have more real-time data, now you can send messaging to the students. So for example, if a student has completed an action, instead of us waiting for a week for the latest data, you're sending a student, hey, you did something 2 weeks ago, like good job. We're now can send it the next day. It says, oh, you did this yesterday, here's your next step. Really keeping the student and parents engaged when you have the data. Or even with our messaging, we would have to make sure before we send a text or email, do we have the latest data? Because we don't want to send this message because the student may say, I did this, but we didn't have the data there. So it stops all that kind of herky-jerky messaging based on not having the latest data. As we mentioned earlier with the high school counselors, they have the latest data. So now they can case manage the students better that are on their campuses. Don't have to call Barbara, email any of the Promise coordinators on what's the status, or the parents texting in, what's the status? The data is there for the counselors to see. And also helps with the real-time reporting on how is the program doing, where maybe need support for certain high schools, or if there's irregularities, there's something a report I did for Barbara yesterday, and she was like, it showed the students like all did something, it was 100% answer. and she caught it right away, right? Because the data is there in real time. She was like, this doesn't look right. And sure enough, there was a little bug that I noted and I got to go fix in the data. But now it didn't go like weeks or months before we found it. Like if there is a mistake, you're going to find it faster and address it, as opposed to it being these gaps when the data is coming in. So that's where we're at. And so we hope to be able to implement this. Thankfully, NCTC had the tools already in place to do it, but this kind of ties into Mark. Mark is going to be showing a tool